Hi, my name is Dr. Thorsten Reiter, and today I want to talk to you about three big misconceptions or myths that are killing innovation and what you can do about it. But before we start, I want to give you a little preview. Something you might not be able to understand at this very moment, but I promise it will be something you understand when the keynote is over, right? So, my whole point today will be about the fact that for sustainable innovation, what you want is the Beatles in your castle playing educational songs to everyone around. I know, it sounds weird, but let's get to it. I want to start by telling you a story, a real story. It's a story about innovation and innovators. Whenever I ask my students in class or attendees in the workshop who they think of when they hear the word innovation, one name always comes up more often than any other. And you might be thinking the name just now at this very moment in your head. I'll give you a second. Who do you think of when you hear the word innovation? Yes, that's right. It's Steve Jobs. So the story I want to tell you is about innovation and Steve Jobs. It is the true story of the creation of the iPhone, not how it's usually being told, but how it should be told. Because when you think about the iPhone and how it changed the way we communicate and work and consume content, we think of Steve Jobs, standing on the porch, with his turtleneck and glasses, gazing into the future and envisioning the iPhone. And obviously we imagine this all in black and white with the slogan, "Think different" under it. And then he simply gives his employees the instructions on what to do and how to do it. And bam, there's our new reality with this device that is now an extension of our body, our brain, and ourselves. But this is actually not how it happened. The BlackBerry came out in 1999, and devices such as notebooks were getting smaller in the subsequent years, while consumers became less reliant on location. The tendency towards portable devices was becoming clearer and clearer, and in 2001, eventually the iPod came out by Apple, and they further wanted to go into that mobile direction. Funny side note, in the beginning, Steve Jobs believed that cell phones would only serve a very small niche market. However, a group of very enthusiastic engineers at Apple called the Interaction Group believed that the way we interact with devices will have to change. For instance, they believed that clicking and typing might not be the best way to navigate the more and more interactive features of the constantly spreading internet. After quite some persuasion and prototyping, they were able to convince Steve Jobs to try to venture into, the mobile world. And they had no idea what they had unleashed. Because Steve Jobs' approach to project management looked like this. He set up two internal development teams that had different starting points, but with the same goal, the creation of a mobile phone the Apple way, right? So the development team, which previously had developed the iPod, was led by Tony Fadell, who had the task of turning the iPod into a phone. And another team, led by Scott Forstall, had the task to shrink the Mac iOS into a phone. And Steve Jobs made it very clear that those teams were competing against one another. And the winner would take all the spoils, whereas the losing team would be pretty much done. So, the work began, and I don't want to go into all the details, but some innovative milestones are definitely worth mentioning. One of the biggest milestones was the decision to make the keyboard digital instead of physical. But none of the existing technologies could do that given the supposed small size of the device. So one day, an employee by the name of Tina Huang brought a touch device into the office, which she was using for her PC because of an injury to her hand. But the developers who saw that technology knew this would change everything. One of the designers immediately talked to Steve Jobs about the idea of using touch technology on a digital screen, and all Steve Jobs had to say about this was, "That can only be helpful when reading something on the toilet." What a visionary. Anyway, he did change his mind, and the company that came up with the idea, called Fingerworks, was bought by Apple in order to make the touch technology for the iPhone possible. And the former CEO of Fingerworks, Wayne Westerman, still works for Apple to this day. And I know you probably never heard his name before, right? The name of the man who made the iPhone possible. Kind of the point of the whole story, really. So the touch technology was still too inaccurate for the small screen, and they experimented with different ideas such as a rotary phone mechanic to pick the right letter, but that obviously didn't catch on. And actually there was no single designer who was able to figure it out until a software engineer proposed that given the location of the finger on the screen paired with the previous location, they could calculate the likelihood of what letter the user might be intending to press. So for instance, in the English language, when you already press the letter T, the likelihood that you want to press H next, when your finger on the keyboard is close to G, H, and K, is extremely high. So only in an interdisciplinary team effort, they were able to solve that problem. And the last interesting feature I want to mention was the slide to unlock idea, because nobody ever unlocked a completely digital screen before. How would you do it in a way that people would get it right away? So one designer was struck by an amazing idea when using the bathroom on an airplane. Maybe you noticed that they have very similar sliding locks. And when he gave a prototype of that slide to unlock mechanic to his 3-year-old daughter, she immediately knew what to do. As you can imagine, this was a very exhausting process, and Steve Jobs made sure to push his employees to their limits and beyond. He created an atmosphere of fear and glooming damnation and stress. And the time pressure was so high and the task so difficult that people had to sleep in their offices. Some got sick and 2 marriages even failed as an immediate outcome of the whole thing. And one employee was so frustrated because she was not able to see her family due to the amount of work that she slammed her office door so hard the handle broke off and she had to be freed using a baseball bat to smash the door in. But then finally the new team by Scott Forstall had made it. The big day was finally here, and Steve Jobs went on stage to present the iPhone to the world in San Francisco on January 9th, 2007. And this is where his visionary leadership skills really come to show. Because when he came to the part of how easily you can handle your contact list, together with the rubber band effect, that bounces the screen a little when you reach the bottom in order to show the user that the program has not crashed, people were excited. And remember, a lot of Apple's own employees are sitting in that audience. So Steve Jobs then proceeded to show how easy it is to delete a contact with the swipe of a finger. And in all previous rehearsals, he had picked a random name, but this time, in front of a live audience, he picked the name of Tony Fadell, the team leader of the losing team that had to follow the iPod approach. This was the sign from the highest boss that Tony Fadell was in trouble. And every employee from Apple who saw that presentation knew it too. And only a few months later, Fadell, the father of the iPod, had been forced to leave the company. And Wayne Westerman, whose Fingerworks technology made the iPhone possible in the first place, he was not even invited to the event at all. What an inspiring story, isn't it? Work hard, fail hard, and get fired. I cannot recall Steve Jobs ever making this management philosophy public, but maybe I missed it. In my opinion, there's a lot to learn from this story when it comes to innovation. So let me directly get into my first big misconception. Because number one is, innovation is actually not created by a single genius, but by you and the people around you. As we saw from the story of the iPhone, Steve Jobs obviously did not invent the iPhone, and he also did not envision it or how it will look like. Actually, no person did. They had a broad idea where the path should be going, and everything else was a relentless collaborative effort of trial and error. Now, obviously, there was an important involvement of Steve Jobs. He used his hierarchical power and maybe even other intimidation tactics to make sure that he will get an answer to the question, how will Apple be part of the mobile world? He would not let anyone off the hook until he got the answer, even though he had no idea of what the answer would specifically look like. And we all know by now that innovation does need highest management support. But I doubt that the support which Steve Jobs stood for is actually the best kind of support. Because everyone supporting and pushing for innovation always has 2 options to choose from. They can exploit or explore. I also call this the Steve Jobs versus the Beatles way. What do I mean by that? Well, there are 2 types of how this collaborative effort of innovation can be done. One is an exploitative way and one is an explorational way. I think from what we know now, we can safely say that Steve Jobs went with the first option, exploitation. He created internal competition. He pushed people to and beyond their limits, and in the end forced an answer out of the people at his disposal. Very creative and highly skilled people, but nevertheless at his disposal. And people hated it, Sure, now we got the iPhone, but at what cost? And what does that mean for the sustainability of innovation? Because Steve's determined will and the creativity and skills of his employees together made the iPhone happen. For this, he implicitly accredited himself as somewhat of an artist. But everyone listening today immediately can feel that this is not the best way of doing it. But empirically, we saw extraordinary success with that. But it's not sustainable. And I will come back to why it's not sustainable in a minute. However, there's also a different way, right? We can approach innovation by exploring what we not know through others. And by helping others to understand what they need to know in order to create something great. People coming together on a path of exploration. And this is the way of a sustainable capability of innovation that does not fade, but renews itself over and over because there's always so much more we do not know. And it attracts and keeps curious and creative people at your company. Different experts from maybe unrelated fields come together and exchange ideas and inspire one another in order to create something the world has never seen before or never heard of it before. As I mentioned, more like the Beatles. A combination of effort, practice, and mutual inspiration led to the music innovation of the 20th century. So don't try to be like Steve Jobs. Be the Beatles, because innovation only prevails in the Beatles way. And I will tell you why. Because Steve Jobs stands for something that Reed Hastings, the CEO and founder of Netflix, calls brilliant jerks. These are people who are really good at what they do on a content level, but are really not nice. People don't want to work with them, or especially for them. And those people not only enforce an environment where other people do not like to work for a very long time, but it also focuses on a single person, almost like a cult. And that might work for as long as the specific person still works at that company, but as soon as something goes wrong and the person leaves the company, everything will come crashing down. Because the company has done nothing to build broader structures to support innovation. And in order to explore how innovation explicitly works in a collective, beyond a single person. And you can ask yourself, what was the last world-changing innovation from Apple? Was it the Apple Pencil? I don't think so. It probably was the iPad, And ever since Steve Jobs died, the innovation capability of Apple, which was only fueled by a person-centric exploitative focus, left with him. Now, you're not supposed to talk bad about dead people. And I did not know Steve Jobs at all, and maybe he was a very nice person. I don't know. And the point of this story and these remarks is not to trash talk him, because his actions are only a representation of a structural problem, a misconception that harm innovation all over the world. And that is why I'm being so hard on him. What is kind of ironic is that the fact that Steve Jobs himself actually foreshadowed this development that is now taking place at Apple in an interview in the mid-80s. But back then he was talking about Xerox. And he said, once a company that spent so much money and time on a new technology and then introduced that technology successfully in the market, eventually the marketing and salespeople will take over, pushing the hell out of this technology with no incentive to do anything else. No incentive to produce more disruptive technologies. And as you know, the people bringing in the money eventually get to say what happens next. So they further push sales, focusing on existing technologies, and thereby they dig their own innovation grave, which is filled with a lot of money for a certain amount of time, but it doesn't last. In order for it to last, you need innovators all over your company. And for that, you need a culture of trust, where people can say, I don't know. Where trust and making your voice heard is more valued than ego, because ego actually is quite a big problem when it comes to innovation. In science, there is this phenomenon that scientists often produce their most influential ideas at the very beginning of their career, when they are still basically clueless. Or at the very end, when their career is almost over. And what's the reason for that? My answer is ego. Because someone who can openly say that he doesn't know enough yet can listen and ask questions more easily. The same applies to someone who has nothing left to prove. And that is why a culture of trust is important. A culture that has established that not knowing is not a problem. It is actually the beginning of everything. It is the beginning of innovation. And one first step in creating such a culture of trust is educating your employees about this first misconception. They must forget about the myth that great innovation comes from great minds only, whatever that is supposed to mean anyway. Where in fact it actually comes from average people, working together and asking one another the right questions. Because without this, honest culture of trust, they will not speak up about opportunities for innovation when they see them. While they are the ones most likely to identify specific opportunities of innovation. They might not know, how exactly those opportunities can be seized, but they must have the courage to go to their peers and even the boss, and say, listen, I found this thing, I don't know how, but I think we can do this better. Can someone help me figure this out? Only when you make it absolutely clear to your organization that it's the right questions and not the right answers that matter. Only then you can create a culture of trust that you need in order to move your focus away from brilliant jerks to create the Beatles. Let's move on to the second big misconception when it comes to innovation. And I think when you hear it, a lot of people might immediately feel that it's true, right? But somehow managers still always keep working against it. They do not embrace it and hence cannot manage it properly. Because number two is innovation does not come from the inside, but from the outside of the organization. And as you already witnessed in the story of, on how the iPhone was created, crucial parts, such as the fingerworks technology, was brought up. Also, the idea in the first place did not start somewhere inside, but was the observation of the external environment. The BlackBerry was around, and we could see the trend of people doing more and more stuff on their phones. So, no matter how disruptive the iPhone seems to be today, in hindsight, only its execution was. But that was not the case for the idea. So imagine, even at Apple, people needed the external world for input. And that is okay. And now let me tell you something, and please, this is not to offend anyone, simply a fact. The best people do not work for your organization. You know why I know this? Because most people don't work for your organization. Most people work outside your company. So statistically speaking, also the best people do not work for you because most people don't work for you. And here are some more news. That is okay. No company has the best people, not even Google. But let me come back to those outstanding examples on innovation that, by the way, do not provide too much insight on how organizations can create sustainable and recurring innovation because they have very specific contexts which do not apply to most organizations. So we have to be very careful who we choose as best practice for innovation. But as I said, I will come back to this in a minute. So what do you do if you cannot count on the inside of your corporation only to come up with new ideas, new innovations and business models? Well, in a nutshell, you need to listen more than you talk. But what does that mean for your organization? Well, you have to build two things, a beacon and pathways. Let me explain. Imagine your organization as a medieval castle, with a little town and high walls surrounding it. Everything is carved out of and built from stone. And on the outside you see beautiful forests and glittering waterfalls, vast landscapes and mystical mountains. A lot of free spirits are jumping around, doing incredible stuff, practicing magic. Stuff you, a manager standing on the wall on your castle, do not understand. You stand there with your little binoculars, and actually I don't even know if they existed in the Middle Ages. But anyhow, you stand there and you try to observe what's going on, and how you might also produce this magic. As you can imagine, this magic stands for innovation that you want to utilize. So what do? Well, obviously you send out people, right, to investigate. And they come back with stories and fairy tales, and that might help you a bit. But everything that comes out of those stories really are just nice to have gamification apps that do not have a whole lot of impact on your little society or your progress as a kingdom. So you need a way to embrace all those things. And therefore, you need to attract what's out there. Open up your gates and organize how you can maximize your intake of what's relevant to you. You need access to these forests and lands of innovation. We call this the innovation ecosystem. And the people who are on the frontier of new developments, innovation stakeholders. These are your clients, your partners, universities, suppliers, think tanks, etc. And you must establish processes and structures that put this exchange in the center of your innovation efforts. You need people who have the mandate to build those relationships with the external innovation ecosystem and who build those structures and processes to funnel what is, mostly very unorganized and abstract ideas into manageable innovation processes inside your firm. But that's not enough, because even your best scouts will not hear about all important ideas that are going around this innovation ecosystem. You will also need to build a beacon, a shiny beacon on the top of your kingdom, a flag that signals to all those innovation stakeholders outside your firm that you are open to their ideas. This way, innovative people will also come to you. This is a crucial success factor since you will be sought after. If someone has an idea that could disrupt your industry, instead of fighting her, you offer her open gates to collaborate with you. In real life, that is getting the word out, on LinkedIn, YouTube, blogs, trade publications, or whatever I'm doing here, in this conference, letting people know we want new ideas, we are here to work with you, we want to listen. And that is another important aspect I mentioned earlier, to listen. Because you might think that you know what specific innovation problem you have, and then you are looking for answers only to solve that problem, just like Apple tried to fix the physical keyboard onto a given screen space. But in reality, they needed a digital solution, a probability algorithm. You can only find those answers when you listen. And let me now quickly come back to my point earlier about those big shots of innovation. Did you ever wonder why they're all in Silicon Valley? In the beginning, they did not go to Silicon Valley and then, they became successful. Silicon Valley was that innovation ecosystem, that magical forest where people were hanging out after work in craft beer bars and talked about the future, essentially. Some of those people listened. And the next morning, sometimes still hungover, they carried the innovation back to their company. And sometimes they directly brought the innovation stakeholder with them and hired them on the spot. And there were also other places in the US, such around Route 66, which also had a university nearby and was also funded by the military and all that structural advantage that Silicon Valley also had. But that cluster never became an innovation cluster like Silicon Valley did, because people went home after work and they left town on the weekends. There was no exchange in the Silicon Valley way. And that is why those organizations now dominate the market, because they listened very carefully. And now we reached the last misconception that is killing innovation, which is number 3. Innovation is not a tool, it's a strategy. In order to get all those things in place, the right culture, the processes and structures to interact with the external innovation ecosystem, tools alone will not suffice. We all know the tools, workshops on design thinking and lean startup and business model canvas and agile and you name it. If you only rely on those tools, thinking you put some interns into a colorful room with post-its on the glass walls, nothing will come from this. Maybe except a nice-to-have gamification app, but not a needed innovation to propel your organization forwards. Because we have to understand that the world has changed around us dramatically. This is not the same world we knew 15 or 20 years ago. The world we now see is called VUCA, V-U-C-A. And you probably heard that term before. It's, volatile, uncertain, complex, and filled with ambiguity. And if you approach this new world with workshops alone, it's like trying to patch up the Titanic with Band-Aids. You need a holistic approach that actually comprises 50% of your company's strategy. Because the two things your company does is also exploitation and exploration. The first half is exploitation in the sense of maximizing the efficiency of your already established operations, automation, outsourcing. You focus on doing things right. But the other half is the exploration of new business models, new markets, and hence innovation. It's not about doing things right, it's about doing the right things, effective innovation. And to be effective and create sustainable, repeatable innovation, you need to forget about calculating risks and focus on managing uncertainty instead. Because, as we said before, you don't even know what your problem might be tomorrow. How do you want to calculate the risk of that? Let me spare you the trouble, you can't. And to tackle this enormous task, you're going to need more than workshops and tools. You need an effective innovation strategy. Because if you don't, you will always feel that innovation is random, when it's not. It can be managed. And we talked about the necessary building blocks before. You need the right culture, the right processes and structures inside and outside your firm to be ready for that. One way of strategically doing this is an internal innovation division that has the mandate to sense external opportunities and threats and to seize the opportunities by utilizing these structures and processes and defend against the threats. And they need the mandate to constantly transform the organization, a process in which the organization is educated as a whole and the culture we so desperately need for innovation is spread. And who works in these divisions? Well, innovation managers do. But so far, very few companies know what that's even supposed to mean exactly. And they are only now understanding what the qualifications of these people are and that they might be quite different from what they are used to. Because in order to tie all those threads together, in order to help to build an effective innovation strategy, innovation managers need to be a multitude of things. They need to be relationship managers because they need to listen to the innovation stakeholders in the innovation ecosystem. They also need to be salespeople because they need to get the organization excited about vague and not yet readily developed ideas. They also need to be analytical strategists because they need to find ways of how those very abstract ideas and opportunities in the market can be translated into business models that have symbiotic relationships with the existing business models of your organization. They need to be creative, in order to paint this colorful interpretation of the future that enables other people to buy in on and enables them to collaborate on ideas that originally were not even their own. And they also need to have an entrepreneurial mindset that allows them to look beyond temporary shortfalls and pushing through inertia biases that reside inside any organization. And they also need to be corporate developers because they need to establish structures and processes that are embedded in the very fabric of the organization, that help to educate your employees, change their culture, and provide unbureaucratic funding for new ideas. And last but not least, speaking of education, they also need to be educators, because the knowledge and the best and worst practices of innovation from the past need to be reflected on, made explicit, and taught to a critical mass of people, so that they can stand on the shoulders of giants and take the next big leap. Taking all these things together, you might think to yourself, does such a person even exist? Well, maybe they are not as abundant individually, but they exist in a team. And that has been my point ever since I started talking. What a sustainable, effective innovation strategy needs is a team that has the specific mandate to do exactly those things, and collectively you can create a culture, processes and structures that make innovation repeatable and not a random genius event, which it never was. But knowing that these are the characteristics and tasks that are needed will make you identify those actually differently thinking people. The people that you need on your team and in your organization. And in the end, you will have the Beatles in your castle, playing educational songs to everyone around. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you liked the input. If you want to get in touch, just hit me up on LinkedIn. Also, if you want to know more about the foundations of innovation, you can pre-order my book called Killing Innovation, coming out early next year. I think the link should be provided somewhere around here. And anyway, thank you again for your time and have a great day. Greetings from Switzerland, from Zurich at Swiss Life, Switzerland. Thank you very much. Bye.